Miyamoto Musashi. On June 13, 1645, 61-year-old Miyamoto Musashi sat kneeling in a cave called Reigondo near Kumamoto. Musashi had spent decades as Japan's most feared swordsman, fighting 61 duels to the death and never losing a single one. He developed a revolutionary two-sword fighting technique and written treatises on strategy that influenced military thinking for centuries. By 1645, Musashi had retired from dueling. He'd spent his final years as a hermit, living in the cave and dedicating himself to philosophy, painting and writing. His body had begun failing. He developed thoracic cancer that caused pain and difficulty breathing. Musashi knew his death was approaching. Rather than seeking medical treatment or comfort, he chose to spend his remaining time in solitude and contemplation. He sat at a small wooden desk in the cave, writing by candlelight. In his final weeks, Musashi composed the Dokudo, meaning the way of walking alone. This brief text contained 21 precepts for living an independent, disciplined life. The rules reflected his lifetime of martial experience distilled into philosophical wisdom. On June 13th, Miyamoto Musashi died while kneeling at his desk in Reigondo Cave. The man who'd killed dozens of opponents in single combat died peacefully from natural causes, a writing brush in his hand rather than a sword. Musashi's death was extraordinary precisely because it was ordinary. The deadliest swordsman in Japanese history never fell in battle. He died undefeated, his perfect record intact. His writings, particularly the Book of Five Rings and the Dokudo, became foundational texts in Japanese martial philosophy. Saigo Takamori. On September 24, 1877, 49-year-old Saigo Takamori stood on Shiroyama Hill near Kagoshima, surrounded by government forces. Saigo had been one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration, helping overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate and restore imperial rule. However, he'd grown disillusioned with the new government's modernization policies and treatment of the samurai class. Saigo had led the Satsuma Rebellion, the last major samurai uprising against the imperial government. For months, his forces fought against the modern conscript army, equipped with rifles and artillery. By September 1877, Saigo's rebel army had been reduced to a few hundred men trapped on Shiroyama. The Battle of Shiroyama began before dawn on September 24th. Government forces numbering over 30,000 attacked from all sides. Saigo's remaining samurai fought with traditional swords and spears against overwhelming firepower. The battle was hopeless. During the fighting, a bullet struck Saigo in the hip. He fell, unable to stand. As government forces closed in, Saigo knew capture was imminent. According to samurai tradition, he decided to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, to preserve his honor. However, his injury prevented him from performing the ritual properly. Saigo couldn't maintain the kneeling position required for seppuku. His loyal lieutenant, Beppu Shinsuke, had to support him physically while Saigo attempted to cut his abdomen. Unable to complete the ritual himself, Saigo gave the signal. Beppu performed kaishaku, the act of beheading to end suffering during seppuku. Saigo Takamori died on Shiroyama Hill. The Battle of Shiroyama marked the end of the samurai era. Saigo became known as the Last Samurai, though his story bore little resemblance to the Hollywood film. He died fighting for a world that was disappearing, killed by the modernization he'd helped create. Oda Nobunaga. On June 21, 1582, 47-year-old Oda Nobunaga was staying at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. Nobunaga had spent decades unifying Japan through brutal military campaigns and political maneuvering. He controlled approximately half of Japan's provinces and was on the verge of complete dominance. His ruthless tactics had made him both feared and hated. That morning, Nobunaga was at the temple, with only a small retinue of guards. Most of his army was away on distant campaigns. One of his trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, was supposed to be marching west to join another campaign. Instead, Mitsuhide turned his army toward Koito. Around dawn, Akechi Mitsuhide's 13,000 troops surrounded Honnoji Temple. Nobunaga woke to the sounds of gunfire and his guards fighting. He initially thought it was a minor disturbance, but quickly realized the temple was under full assault. Nobunaga grabbed a bow and fought from inside the temple, shooting at attackers. However, the situation was hopeless. He was vastly outnumbered, and Mitsuhide's forces were setting fire to the temple buildings. As flames engulfed Honnoji, Nobunaga retreated into the interior of the burning temple. Knowing death was certain, he chose to commit seppuku rather than be captured or killed by his enemies. He performed the ritual suicide as the temple burned around him. Oda Nobunaga died inside the flaming temple. However, his body was never found. The intense fire reduced everything to ash, and no remains could be definitively identified as Nobunaga's. The absence of a body sparked centuries of speculation. Some theorists claimed Nobunaga escaped and lived in hiding. However, he almost certainly died in the temple, his body simply consumed entirely by the flames. The The disappearance of Japan's most powerful warlord's remains added mystery to his already legendary status. Sanada Yukimura. On June 3, 1615, 48-year-old Sanada Yukimura fought in the summer siege of Osaka, the final battle that would establish Tokugawa dominance over Japan. Yukimura had allied with the Toyotomi clan against Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces. He was renowned as the Crimson Demon for his red armor and fearless combat. That day, Yukimura led a desperate assault directly at Tokugawa Ieyasu's command post. His forces broke through multiple defensive lines, coming closer to killing the future shogun than anyone else in the battle. Tokugawa's forces were thrown into chaos. However, Yukimura's men were outnumbered and eventually forced to retreat. The fighting had been intense. Yukimura himself had been in constant combat for hours. By the time his forces fell back, he was physically exhausted. Yukimura made his way to a small shrine called Yasui Shrine. He removed his distinctive red helmet and sat down against a tree to rest. His body could no longer continue fighting. Enemy soldiers soon spotted him sitting there. According to historical accounts, when the soldiers approached, Yukimura recognized that escape was impossible. He reportedly said, "I am Sanada Yukimura. Take my head." He made no attempt to defend himself or flee. The soldiers killed Yukimura where he sat. His head was taken as proof of his death. Sanada Yukimura, who'd fought so fiercely just hours before, died too exhausted to resist. His final words acknowledged both his identity and his acceptance of death. Yukimura became a legendary figure in Japanese culture, celebrated for his bravery and loyalty, despite fighting on the losing side of history. Uesugi Kenshin. On April 19, 1578, 48-year-old Uesugi Kenshin collapsed in his castle's lavatory. Kenshin, known as the Dragon of Echigo, had been one of the most powerful warlords of the Sengoku period. He'd fought numerous campaigns and was famous for his rivalry with Takeda Shingen. On the morning of April 19th, Kenshin had been experiencing stomach pain. He went to the lavatory and collapsed there. Servants found him unconscious. He never regained consciousness and died 4 days later on April 23rd. The official cause of death was likely a stroke or similar medical emergency. However, the circumstances of his death in the lavatory sparked legends. One persistent story claimed an assassin had hidden in the cesspit beneath Kenshin's toilet for days, then speared him from below at his most vulnerable moment. While the assassination story is almost certainly false, it became part of Kenshin's legend. The idea that such a powerful warlord could be killed by an enemy hiding in human waste appealed to storytellers. The truth, that he died from natural causes while using the toilet, was both more mundane and more human. Kenshin's death left his domain without a clear successor, leading to internal conflict. The man who'd survived countless battles died suddenly from illness. Akechi Mitsuhide. On July 2, 1582, 54-year-old Akechi Mitsuhide was fleeing through the countryside near Kyoto. Just 11 days earlier, Mitsuhide had committed one of the most shocking betrayals in Japanese history. He'd attacked his lord Oda Nobunaga at Honnoji Temple, forcing Nobunaga's death. Mitsuhide had briefly seized power, but his reign lasted only 13 days. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of Nobunaga's other generals, rushed back from a distant campaign and defeated Mitsuhide's forces at the Battle of Yamazaki. After the battle, Mitsuhide fled with a small group of retainers. They traveled through the countryside, trying to reach safety. Mitsuhide wore expensive golden armor that marked him as a high-ranking warrior. As Mitsuhide's group passed through a village called Ogarusu, they encountered local farmers. One farmer, seeing the golden armor, realized this was someone valuable. The farmers attacked with bamboo spears, hoping to claim the armor and any reward. In the chaotic struggle, a bamboo spear struck Mitsuhide. The wound was serious enough that he couldn't continue fleeing. Realizing capture was imminent, Mitsuhide committed seppuku to avoid being taken alive. His head was then taken by the farmers. The man who'd killed Oda Nobunaga, one of Japan's most powerful warlords, died at the hands of peasants with improvised weapons. The golden armor that should have protected him had instead marked him as a target. Akechi Mitsuhide's death was as ignominious as his brief rule. Ishida Mitsunari. On November 6, 1600, 40-year-old Ishida Mitsunari was executed in Kyoto. Mitsunari had been one of the leaders of the Western Coalition at the Battle of Sekigahara, the decisive battle that gave Tokugawa Ieyasu control of Japan. The Western Coalition had lost, and Mitsunari was captured. As a high-ranking prisoner, Mitsunari was paraded through Kyoto before his execution. Large crowds gathered to see the defeated general. He was sentenced to death by beheading. On the day of his execution, Mitsunari was brought to the execution ground. As was customary, he was offered a final drink of water. However, the guard didn't have water immediately available, and instead offered Mitsunari a dried persimmon. Mitsunari refused the persimmon. When asked why, he explained that persimmons were bad for digestion. The The guard and witnesses were stunned by this response. Mitsunari was about to be beheaded, yet he was still concerned about his digestive health. The incident became famous as an example of Mitsunari's character. Even facing imminent death, he maintained concern for his body's well-being. Some interpreted this as absurd, others as an example of extreme discipline and presence of mind. Moments later, Ishida Mitsunari was beheaded. His head was displayed publicly as a warning to anyone who might oppose the Tokugawa. The man who'd carefully refused a persimmon for health reasons died seconds later. Hijikata Toshizo. On June 20th, 1869, 34-year-old Hijikata Toshizo fought in the Battle of Hakodate on the northern island of Hokkaido. Hijikata was the vice commander of the Shinsengumi, a special police force that had fought for the Tokugawa shogunate during Japan's Civil War. After the shogunate's fall, Hijikata and other loyalists had retreated to Hokkaido to continue resistance. The Battle of Hakodate was one of the last major engagements of the Boshin War. Imperial forces, equipped with modern weapons and ships, vastly outnumbered Hijikata's forces. The battle was essentially the final stand of those who opposed Japan's modernization. During the fighting, Hijikata led a cavalry charge against Imperial positions. He rode at the front, wielding both traditional weapons and a modern rifle. As his forces advanced, Imperial troops opened fire with rifles. A bullet struck Hijikata in the lower back as he charged on horseback. The wound was serious. He fell from his horse. His men tried to help him, but Hijikata Toshizo died from the gunshot wound on the battlefield. His death marked a symbolic moment. Hijikata had been one of the last samurai warriors actively fighting against modernization. His death by rifle fire, rather than sword, exemplified the transition Japan was undergoing. The age of the samurai was ending, replaced by modern warfare. Hijikata's body was buried in Hakodate. He became a legendary figure, representing the samurai spirit, fighting against inevitable change. His death effectively marked the end of the samurai era in Japan. Takeda Shingen. On May 13, 1573, 51-year-old Takeda Shingen died during a military campaign. Shingen had been one of the most powerful warlords in Japan, controlling substantial territory and commanding a formidable army. His rivalry with Uesugi Kenshin had produced some of the era's most famous battles. In 1573, Shingen was leading his army toward Kyoto, intending to overthrow the shogunate. However, he fell ill during the campaign. The exact cause is disputed. Some accounts claim he died from illness, possibly pneumonia. Others suggest he was shot by a sniper during a siege and died from infection. Regardless of the cause, Shingen realized he was dying. He gave final instructions to his generals. Most importantly, he ordered them to keep his death secret for 3 years. He wanted to prevent enemies from attacking while his clan transitioned to new leadership. Takeda Shingen died in his camp. His generals followed his orders. They concealed his death from everyone outside the innermost circle of retainers. Some accounts claim they used a body double, called a kagemusha, to impersonate Shingen at public appearances. For 3 years, the Takeda clan maintained the deception. Enemies who feared Shingen's military genius held back from attacking, believing he still lived. Messages and orders were issued in Shingen's name. The secret was maintained until the clan felt strong enough to reveal the truth. When the truth finally emerged, it shocked Japan. The man who'd been thought to command armies had been dead for years. Takeda Shingen's posthumous deception was perhaps his most successful strategy, buying his clan 3 crucial years. Minamoto no Yorimasa. On June 20th, 1180, 74-year-old Minamoto no Yorimasa faced defeat at the Battle of Uji. Yorimasa had been a respected warrior and poet of the late Heian period. He'd raised arms against the Taira clan, but was defeated at the Uji River. Realizing the battle was lost and capture was imminent, Yorimasa decided to commit suicide rather than face dishonor. What he did next became historically significant. Yorimasa retreated to the Byodoin temple near the battlefield. He took out a fan and composed a death poem, writing it on the fan's surface. The poem reflected on his life and impending death. After finishing the poem, he performed seppuku, cutting his abdomen with his sword. This is considered one of the first clearly documented instances of ritual seppuku. While samurai had committed suicide before, Yorimasa's death established many elements that would become standard in the ritual: the death poem, the formal setting, and the specific method. Minamoto no Yorimasa died at age 74, remarkable for the era. His death helped codify seppuku as the honorable death for defeated samurai. The practice would continue for nearly 700 years, becoming central to samurai culture. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments. Spartacus. In 71 BC, approximately 38-year-old Spartacus faced his final battle along the Salarius River in southern Italy. Spartacus had led the largest slave revolt in Roman history, commanding an army of escaped gladiators and slaves that had defeated multiple Roman legions. For 2 years, his rebel army had terrorized Rome, but now 6 legions under Marcus Licinius Crassus had cornered them. Before the battle, Spartacus made a dramatic gesture that became legendary. He brought his own horse to the front lines in full view of his men. He drew his sword and killed the horse, declaring that if he won the battle, he would have plenty of Roman horses to choose from, and if he lost, he wouldn't need one anyway. The Battle of the Salarius River was brutal and desperate. Spartacus fought to break through the Roman lines and reach Crassus himself. Ancient sources describe him cutting through Roman soldiers, trying to fight his way to the general's position. During the fighting, a spear struck Spartacus in the thigh. The wound forced him to one knee. Rather than retreat or surrender, he planted his shield in the ground and continued fighting from his knees. Roman soldiers surrounded him, striking from all sides. Spartacus fought until he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. He died on the battlefield, hacked to pieces by Roman swords. After the battle, Roman soldiers searched among thousands of corpses for Spartacus's body. They wanted to display the rebel leader's remains as proof of his death. Despite extensive searching, they never found his body intact. Spartacus had been so thoroughly dismembered during the fighting that his corpse couldn't be identified among the carnage. The legendary gladiator who'd terrified Rome simply disappeared into the mass of dead. His body never recovered or displayed. Flamma. In the 2nd century AD, approximately 30-year-old Flamma died in the arena during his 34th fight. Flamma, whose name meant the flame, had been a Syrian gladiator who achieved unprecedented success in the games. Most gladiators died within their first 5 fights, but Flamma had survived and won dozens of times. Flamma's record was extraordinary: 34 fights, 21 victories, 9 draws, and only 4 defeats. His skill and ferocity made him a crowd favorite. Emperors and wealthy sponsors showered him with gifts and money. Roman law allowed successful gladiators to earn freedom through excellence in combat. The symbol of freedom was the rudis, a wooden sword presented to a gladiator being released from service. Receiving the rudis meant a gladiator could retire, live as a free man, and never fight again. Flamma was awarded the rudis 4 separate times during his career. This was virtually unprecedented. 4 different times he was offered freedom and retirement. 4 times he refused. Flamma was addicted to the arena. He craved the roar of the crowd, the adrenaline of combat, and the glory of victory. He couldn't imagine life outside the sand-covered floor where he'd made his name. On his 34th fight, Flamma's luck finally ran out. The specific details of his final match aren't recorded, but he died in combat. His grave inscription proudly records his statistics: 34 fights, 4 refusals of freedom. Flamma died exactly where he'd chosen to be, doing exactly what he loved. The gladiator who'd turned down freedom 4 times got his wish to die in the arena. Spiculus. In 68 AD, the gladiator Spiculus died beneath falling marble statues in Rome's Forum. Spiculus had been Emperor Nero's absolute favorite gladiator, elevated far beyond typical arena fighters. Nero had showered Spiculus with palaces, estates, and wealth equal to Rome's most powerful generals. Spiculus lived more like a nobleman than a slave. He owned property throughout Italy, attended imperial banquets, and was treated as one of Nero's close companions. His success in the arena combined with imperial favor made him one of the wealthiest gladiators in history. In June 68 AD, Nero's reign collapsed. The Senate declared him a public enemy, and military commanders throughout the empire rebelled. Nero fled Rome, knowing he faced capture and execution. As Nero prepared to commit suicide, he desperately sent messengers to find Spiculus. He wanted his favorite gladiator to kill him quickly and painlessly. Spiculus couldn't be found in time. Nero killed himself on June 9, 68 AD, stabbing himself in the throat with a dagger. His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome into civil war. The Roman mob, celebrating Nero's downfall, turned their rage on anyone associated with the hated emperor. They hunted for Spiculus, who'd been Nero's most visible favorite. When they found him, they dragged him to the Forum. Throughout Rome, massive marble statues of Nero stood in public spaces. The mob toppled these statues, pulling them down with ropes. They positioned Spiculus beneath one of the falling monuments. The multi-ton marble statue crashed down, crushing Spiculus to death. The gladiator who'd been showered with palaces and wealth died beneath a falling image of his patron, killed by the same mob that had once cheered his victories. Crixus. In 72 BC, Crixus died in battle against Roman legions near Mount Garganus in southern Italy. Crixus had been Spartacus's second-in-command during the Third Servile War, one of the rebel army's most capable generals. He led a faction of Gallic and Germanic gladiators within Spartacus's forces. In 72 BC, strategic disagreements caused Crixus to split from Spartacus's main army. He took approximately 30,000 followers, mostly fellow Gauls and Germans. Crixus wanted to stay in southern Italy, raiding and destroying Roman property. Roman consul Lucius Gellius Publicola moved against Crixus's separated force with 2 legions. The armies met near Mount Garganus. The battle was fierce and bloody, but Roman discipline and tactics prevailed. Crixus died fighting, along with approximately 2/3 of his followers. The Romans decapitated his body and took his head as a trophy. The defeat was a major blow to the slave rebellion. When Spartacus learned of Crixus's death, he organized an extraordinary funeral tribute. Rather than simply mourning his fallen general, Spartacus decided to honor him in the tradition of gladiatorial combat. He took 300 Roman prisoners of war captured during previous battles. Spartacus armed the Roman prisoners and forced them to fight each other to the death as gladiators. The battles took place around Crixus's funeral pyre. The Romans, trained as legionaries rather than arena fighters, were forced to entertain the rebel army. The spectacle reversed the normal order of Roman society. Romans who'd captured and enslaved others were now forced to die as entertainment for escaped slaves. Spartacus's funeral games for Crixus became one of the rebellion's most symbolic acts. Urbicus. In the 3rd century AD, 22-year-old Urbicus died in the arena at the hands of an opponent he'd previously spared. Urbicus had been a secutor, a type of heavily armored gladiator designed to fight the net-wielding Retaterius. He'd achieved success in the games, building a reputation in Florence. During one of Urbicus's fights, he defeated his opponent decisively. The man lay wounded and defenseless. Urbicus could have killed him, securing a clear victory. Instead, he chose mercy. Urbicus spared his opponent's life, allowing him to survive and potentially fight another day. The crowd's reaction to such mercy varied. Some appreciated the display of humanity, while others wanted to see death. The spared gladiator survived, healed from his wounds, and continued fighting in the games. Months or perhaps years later, the scheduling masters arranged a rematch. Urbicus would fight the same man again. The second fight went differently. This time, the opponent won. He stood over Urbicus, who now lay defeated and vulnerable. The crowd and referee awaited his decision. The opponent chose not to return Urbicus's earlier mercy. He executed Urbicus in the arena. The man whose life had been spared showed no similar compassion. Urbicus's gravestone, discovered by archaeologists, contains a bitter epitaph. The inscription reads, "After breaking my opponent, I did not kill him immediately. Fate and the cunning treachery of the referee killed me." The final line offers advice. "I advise you to kill the one you have conquered." The epitaph suggests Urbicus believed the referee had somehow betrayed him during the rematch. It also expresses regret for showing mercy. The gladiator, who'd chosen compassion, died because his opponent chose cruelty. Diodorus. In the 2nd or 3rd century AD, Diodorus died in the arena in Amisus, a city in what is now Turkey. Diodorus was a skilled gladiator who'd won numerous fights. His death became infamous because of how it occurred, involving apparent treachery by the referee. Diodorus fought an opponent named Demetrius. The fight went in Diodorus's favor. He knocked Demetrius to the ground, establishing clear dominance. Under normal circumstances, Diodorus would either finish his opponent or await the crowd's judgment. The Summa Rudis, the referee who controlled arena fights, intervened. He stopped the fight and paused the action. This wasn't unusual. Referees had authority to halt matches temporarily. Diodorus, following the referee's signal, stepped back and lowered his guard. He assumed the fight was over, or being paused for some legitimate reason. While Diodorus was relaxed and unprepared, the referee allowed Demetrius to stand up. Demetrius, given this unexpected second chance, immediately attacked. He lunged at the unsuspecting Diodorus and killed him before Diodorus could defend himself. The crowd erupted in outrage. The circumstances of Diodorus's death appeared to involve deliberate betrayal by the referee. Whether the referee had been bribed, held a grudge, or had other motives remains unknown. Diodorus's gravestone preserves his accusation for eternity. The inscription states, "After breaking my opponent Demetrius, I did not kill him immediately. Fate and the cunning treachery of the referee killed me." The epitaph explicitly blames the referee's actions for the death. Diodorus's memorial became a permanent record of corruption in the games. Bato. Between 211 and 217 AD, the gladiator Bato died from exhaustion after being forced to fight 3 consecutive opponents in a single day. Bato had been a famous champion during the reign of Emperor Caracalla. Caracalla was obsessed with gladiatorial combat and frequently attended the games. The emperor decided to test Bato's limits. He ordered Bato to fight not 1, but 3 fully armed fresh opponents consecutively on the same day. There would be no rest between fights. The first opponent entered the arena at full strength. Bato, also fresh, fought and killed him. The victory was hard-won, and Bato sustained injuries during the combat. Without rest or medical attention, the second opponent entered. Bato was now wounded, tired, and facing a completely fresh fighter. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, Bato managed to kill the second opponent as well. By now, Bato was bleeding from multiple wounds, his armor was damaged, and his strength was nearly gone. His shield felt impossibly heavy. His sword arm could barely lift the blade. The third opponent entered the arena, fresh and uninjured. Bato tried to continue fighting, but his body had reached its limit. The third gladiator cut down the exhausted champion. Bato died not from lack of skill, but from impossible circumstances. He'd proven his excellence by killing 2 opponents consecutively, but no human could fight 3 fresh gladiators in a single day. Caracala's experiment in pushing a champion to his absolute limit resulted in Bato's death. The 6,000 crucified. In 71 BC, approximately 6,000 captured gladiators and slaves died through crucifixion along the Appian Way. These men had fought with Spartacus during the Third Servile War. After Spartacus's death at the Battle of the Salarius River, the rebellion collapsed, and Roman forces captured thousands of survivors. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the general who defeated Spartacus, wanted to send an unmistakable message to Rome's slave population. The punishment needed to be so severe that no slave would ever consider rebellion again. He ordered mass crucifixion on an unprecedented scale. The Appian Way was Rome's most important road, running from Capua, where Spartacus's rebellion had begun, all the way to Rome itself. The distance was approximately 130 miles. Crassus ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along this entire route. Roman soldiers constructed thousands of wooden crosses. They spaced the crosses at regular intervals along both sides of the road. The condemned men were nailed or tied to the crosses and left to die slowly. Crucifixion was designed to be a prolonged, agonizing death. Victims could survive for days, dying from exposure, dehydration, and eventual asphyxiation as their bodies weakened. The 6,000 rebels died over several days, their bodies left on display. Anyone traveling from Capua to Rome passed 6,000 crucified men for the entire 130-mile journey. The message was clear. Rebellion against Rome led to the most horrific death imaginable. The bodies remained on the crosses for weeks or months, left as warnings. The mass crucifixion along the Appian Way became one of ancient Rome's most infamous atrocities. It demonstrated Rome's capacity for brutal repression when its authority was challenged. The 29 Saxons. In 392 AD, 29 Saxon prisoners died by strangling each other in their holding cell the night before they were scheduled to fight. The incident occurred in Rome, where a wealthy politician named Symmachus had spent a fortune purchasing the Saxon prisoners to appear in gladiatorial games he was sponsoring. Symmachus had acquired 29 Saxon warriors captured during conflicts in Germania. He intended them to fight each other in elaborate spectacles designed to impress Rome's elite and advance his political career. The games represented a significant investment and social opportunity. The Saxons were held in the Ludus, the gladiator barracks and training facility, the night before the games. Guards locked them in cells to prevent escape. The prisoners knew they would be forced to kill each other the following day for Roman entertainment. The Saxons made a collective decision. Rather than provide amusement to their captors by fighting each other, they would die on their own terms. They spent the night strangling one another with their bare hands in the darkness. When guards arrived the next morning to collect the prisoners for the games, they found all 29 Saxons dead. The bodies lay intertwined on the cell floor. Not one had survived the night. The mass suicide devastated Symmachus financially and politically. His expensive spectacle was ruined. The incident became famous throughout Rome as an example of barbarian defiance. The Saxons had denied Rome the entertainment their deaths were supposed to provide. The 29 Saxons chose death by each other's hands rather than death for Roman amusement. Their coordinated suicide demonstrated that even prisoners facing certain death could still choose how they died. The sponge stick. Around 64 AD, a German prisoner scheduled for arena execution killed himself in a latrine using the communal cleaning sponge. The Roman philosopher Seneca recorded this incident as an example of the extreme measures prisoners took to avoid the games. The prisoner was scheduled to appear in the morning games, likely to be torn apart by wild animals in a damnatio ad bestias execution. This was considered one of the most horrifying forms of Roman execution, reserved for criminals and prisoners of war. Before being led to the arena, the prisoner asked guards for permission to use the latrine. The guards saw no harm in this request and allowed it. The prisoner entered the latrine, which provided brief privacy. Roman public latrines used a tool called a xylospongium for cleaning. This consisted of a sea sponge attached to a wooden stick. The sponges were shared, soaked in vinegar or salt water between uses. The prisoner grabbed the xylospongium and forced it down his own throat. He pushed it deep enough to block his airway completely. The sponge prevented him from breathing, and he suffocated within minutes. Guards discovered his body slumped in the latrine. The prisoner had successfully denied Rome the spectacle of his death. He'd chosen quick suffocation over being mauled by animals in front of a cheering crowd. Seneca recorded this suicide as evidence of human will to maintain dignity, even in desperate circumstances. The philosopher noted that a man could deny Rome's power even when facing certain death. The cartwheel. Around 64 AD, another prisoner recorded by Seneca killed himself using a moving cartwheel while being transported to the arena. Like the latrine suicide, this demonstrated prisoners' desperation to avoid arena deaths. The prisoner was being transported in a wooden cart to the morning games. Armed guards surrounded the cart, preventing escape. The prisoner knew that within hours he would be executed in the arena, likely by wild animals or gladiators. The prisoner sat on the edge of the cart during transport. He appeared to fall asleep, his head nodding forward as if exhausted or resigned to his fate. The guards paid little attention to a sleeping prisoner, who posed no apparent threat. Gradually, the prisoner let his head drop lower and lower with each bump in the road. He positioned his head near the edge of the cart, close to the large wooden wheel rotating as the cart moved. At a calculated moment, the prisoner suddenly thrust his neck between the spokes of the moving wheel. The wheel's rotation caught his neck and twisted it violently. His neck snapped instantly, killing him before guards could react. The cart jolted to a halt. The prisoner's body hung from the wheel, his neck broken. He died instantly, denying Rome the planned entertainment of his arena execution. Seneca recorded this alongside other suicides as evidence that prisoners would endure anything, including self-inflicted death, to avoid the humiliation and terror of arena execution. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments. Ip Man. On December 2nd, 1972, 79-year-old Ip Man died in his Hong Kong apartment. Ip Man had spent decades teaching Wing Chun Kung Fu, eventually becoming world-famous as Bruce Lee's teacher. By 1972, he'd established Wing Chun internationally and trained thousands of students. However, Ip Man's life had been far more complicated than the heroic portrayal in later films. He'd struggled with opium addiction for many years. Opium smoking was common in early 20th century China, but Ip Man's habit had been severe and long-lasting. The chronic opium use had damaged Ip Man's health significantly. By the early 1970s, he'd developed throat cancer. The cancer was likely connected to decades of smoking opium through pipes. His condition deteriorated through 1972. On December 2nd, Ip Man died in his apartment from the throat cancer. He was 79 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of students and martial artists. Bruce Lee, Ip Man's most famous student, did not attend. Lee had moved to America years earlier and had complicated feelings about his relationship with his teacher. The films depicting Ip Man's life, released decades later, largely omitted his opium addiction and presented a sanitized version of his story. The real Ip Man had been a skilled martial artist, but also a flawed human who struggled with addiction. Brandon Lee. On March 31st, 1993, 28-year-old Brandon Lee was filming a scene for The Crow at Calico Studios in Wilmington, North Carolina. Lee, son of Bruce Lee, had spent years building his own martial arts and acting career. The Crow was supposed to be his breakthrough film, finally establishing him as a star independent of his father's legacy. The scene being filmed involved Lee's character being shot. Actor Michael Massey would fire a .44 Magnum revolver loaded with blank cartridges at Lee from about 15 feet away. The production was running behind schedule and over budget, leading to shortcuts in safety procedures. Earlier in the production, the prop department had created dummy rounds for close-up shots of the revolver. These dummy rounds looked real, but had the gunpowder removed. However, they still contained live primers and bullets. When one dummy round was fired in the gun, the primer ignited with enough force to lodge the bullet tip in the barrel. No one noticed. Later, the same gun was loaded with blank rounds for the shooting scene. Blank rounds contained gunpowder to create a flash and sound, but no bullet. However, the bullet fragment from the earlier dummy round was still stuck in the barrel. At 12:30 a.m., the cameras rolled. Massey fired the revolver at Lee as scripted. The blank's gunpowder charge pushed the lodged bullet fragment out of the barrel with lethal velocity. The fragment struck Lee in the abdomen, penetrating his spine. Lee fell but didn't immediately realize how seriously he was injured. The crew initially thought he was still acting. When they realized he'd actually been shot, they called for medical help. Lee was rushed to New Hanover Regional Medical Center. Surgeons operated for 5 hours, but the damage was too severe. Brandon Lee died at 1:04 p.m. on March 31st, 1993. He would have been filming for just a few more weeks to complete The Crow. The death cemented the Lee family curse legend in popular culture. Both Bruce Lee and his son had died young, at the height of their careers, in seemingly preventable circumstances. Bruce Lee. On July 20th, 1973, 32-year-old Bruce Lee lay down for a nap at the Hong Kong apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei. Lee had spent the morning discussing a film project with producer Raymond Chow. He'd complained of a headache around midday. Pei offered him an Aquagic tablet, a common painkiller containing both aspirin and a muscle relaxant. Lee had revolutionized martial arts in just a few years. He'd created Jeet Kune Do, his own fighting philosophy, and starred in films that made him an international icon. By 1973, he'd become the most famous martial artist in the world, earning substantial income from his Hong Kong films with Enter the Dragon, about to launch his Hollywood career. Around 7:30 p.m., Chow returned to the apartment to pick up Lee for a dinner meeting. He found Lee unconscious and unresponsive. An ambulance rushed him to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, but doctors couldn't revive him. Bruce Lee was pronounced dead at 11:30 p.m. The autopsy revealed cerebral edema, severe swelling of the brain. Lee's brain had swollen from 1,400 grams to 1,525 grams. The official cause of death was listed as hypersensitivity to one of the compounds in Equagesic, likely the aspirin. However, the death sparked decades of speculation. Lee had collapsed once before in May 1973, with similar symptoms. Recent medical studies have proposed an alternative explanation: hyponatremia, a dangerous dilution of blood sodium from drinking excessive water. Lee had his sweat glands surgically removed to look better on camera, which may have impaired his body's ability to regulate fluid balance. Combined with his intense training regimen and possible excessive water consumption, this could have caused his kidneys to fail in processing fluids, leading to brain swelling. Bruce Lee died at the height of his fame and physical condition. The martial artist who'd seemed invincible was killed by something as small as a headache pill, or potentially by drinking too much water. Mitsuharu Misawa. On June 13, 2009, 46-year-old Mitsuharu Misawa was wrestling a tag team match in Hiroshima, Japan. Misawa had been one of professional wrestling's biggest stars for over 2 decades, known for his technical skill and willingness to take dangerous moves. He'd built a legendary career in All Japan Pro Wrestling and later founded his own promotion, Pro Wrestling Noah. That evening's match was routine by Misawa's standards. He'd performed similar matches thousands of times over his 27-year career. His opponents were younger wrestlers, and the match was proceeding normally. Around 8:30 p.m., Misawa's opponent Akitoshi Saito executed a backdrop suplex, a standard move where the wrestler lifts his opponent and falls backward, slamming him to the mat. Misawa took the move as he had countless times before. However, this time something went catastrophically wrong. When Misawa hit the mat, he didn't move. The other wrestlers continued for a moment, assuming Misawa was selling the impact. Then they realized he wasn't responding. Misawa lay motionless on the canvas. Referee and medical staff rushed into the ring. They attempted CPR immediately. Misawa wasn't breathing and had no pulse. An ambulance transported him to Hiroshima City, Asa Hospital, where doctors continued resuscitation efforts. Mitsuharu Misawa was pronounced dead at 10:10 p.m. The impact from the backdrop suplex had caused catastrophic damage to his cervical vertebrae. His atlas and axis, the top 2 vertebrae that support the skull, had separated. This is sometimes called internal decapitation. The spinal cord was severed, causing instant death. Misawa died in the ring in front of thousands of fans and on camera. The footage exists but has rarely been shown out of respect. His death shocked the wrestling world and led to significant changes in safety regulations for Japanese professional wrestling. Duk Koo Kim. On November 13, 1982, 27-year-old Duk Koo Kim entered the ring at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas to fight Ray Boom Boom Mancini for the WBA Lightweight Championship. Kim was a rising Korean boxer who'd fought his way to a title shot. He'd won 17 of his 20 professional fights and was confident he could defeat the champion. The fight was broadcast live on national television. From the opening bell, both fighters engaged in brutal exchanges. Neither man would back down. Mancini landed powerful combinations, but Kim kept pressing forward. The fight went into the later rounds with both men exhausted and battered. By the 14th round, Kim had absorbed tremendous punishment. His face was swollen, and he was bleeding. However, he continued fighting, landing his own shots on Mancini. The 14th round ended, and both fighters returned to their corners. In the 15th and final round, Mancini landed a series of devastating blows. Kim took several hard right hands but remained standing. When the bell rang to end the fight, Kim walked to his corner under his own power. Mancini was declared the winner by technical knockout. Minutes after returning to his dressing room, Duk Koo Kim collapsed. He was rushed to Desert Springs Hospital, where surgeons performed emergency brain surgery. Kim had suffered a subdural hematoma, bleeding between the brain and skull from the repeated impacts. Duk Koo Kim died on November 18, 1982, 4 days after the fight, never regaining consciousness. He was 27 years old. The tragedy didn't end there. Kim's mother flew to Las Vegas and saw her son on life support. Devastated by his death, she committed suicide 4 months later. Richard Green, the referee who'd worked the fight, also took his own life in 1983, reportedly haunted by guilt over not stopping the bout sooner. Kim's death led to major changes in professional boxing. Within months, all major boxing organizations reduced championship fights from 15 rounds to 12 rounds. The change remains in effect today. Evan Tanner. On September 8, 2008, searchers found the body of 37-year-old Evan Tanner in the California desert near Palo Verde. Tanner had been a UFC middleweight champion and one of mixed martial arts' most respected fighters. He'd won the title in 2005 and defended it successfully before losing it in 2006. By 2008, Tanner had stepped away from active competition. He'd always been unconventional, interested in philosophy and self-improvement. He'd written extensively about his struggles with alcohol and his search for meaning. In early September, Tanner decided to take a solo camping trip into the desert for personal reflection. Tanner drove into the remote desert near the California-Arizona border. He'd planned to camp, meditate, and find himself in the solitude. However, temperatures in the area were extreme, regularly exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. On September 4th, Tanner sent text messages to friends describing his situation. He'd run out of water sooner than expected due to the intense heat. His motorcycle had broken down, stranding him. The messages were calm, almost casual. Tanner wrote that he was hiking back to get help and seemed confident he'd be fine. He never made it. When Tanner didn't return or contact anyone, friends alerted authorities. A search team found his body on September 8th in the Palo Verde wash area. Tanner had died from heat exhaustion and dehydration. He was found just a few miles from his camp. Evan Tanner had famously said, "The power of the mind is the only power that matters." He'd believed in mental strength and self-reliance, but in the California desert, nature proved stronger than willpower. Kimbo Slice. On June 6, 2016, 42-year-old Kevin Ferguson, known professionally as Kimbo Slice, was admitted to a hospital in Margate, Florida, with difficulty breathing and chest pain. Kimbo had become internet famous in the early 2000s through backyard fighting videos that went viral before viral was a common term. His street fights, filmed in Miami backyards, had accumulated millions of views. Kimbo had transitioned to professional mixed martial arts, fighting in Elite XC and later the UFC. While his technical skills were questioned, his knockout power and personality made him a draw. By 2016, he'd moved to Bellator MMA and was still actively competing despite his age. On June 6th, Kimbo's breathing difficulties worsened. He was taken to Northwest Medical Center in Margate. Doctors discovered he was in heart failure. Medical examination revealed Kimbo had a mass on his heart and had been on a waiting list for a heart transplant. Despite treatment efforts, Kimbo Slice died that evening from heart failure. He was 42 years old. The autopsy revealed he'd been living with serious heart disease for some time. The internet's most famous street fighter had been competing with a failing heart. His death shocked the combat sports world. Kimbo had seemed physically imposing and powerful. Few knew he'd been fighting not just opponents but also a ticking time bomb in his chest. Andy Hoog. On August 24, 2000, 35-year-old Andy Hoog died at Tokyo Women's Medical University Hospital. Hoog, a Swiss kickboxer known as the Blue-Eyed Samurai, had been one of the world's top fighters. He'd won the K1 World Grand Prix in 1996 and was beloved in Japan for his respectful attitude and devastating axe kicks. Just days earlier, Hoog had arrived in Japan from Switzerland with what seemed like a minor fever. He'd planned to compete in an upcoming tournament. However, the fever worsened rapidly. On August 18th, Hoog checked into the hospital for examination. Doctors ran tests and discovered shocking news. Andy Hoog had acute leukemia, a rapidly progressing blood cancer. The diagnosis was devastating. Hoog, who'd seemed to be in perfect physical condition, was actually gravely ill. The leukemia progressed with terrifying speed. Within days, Hoog's condition deteriorated catastrophically. His body began failing. He suffered internal bleeding, including bleeding from his eyes and nose. The symptoms were excruciating. Throughout his final days, Hoog maintained the stoic composure that had earned him his samurai nickname. Despite the pain and blood, witnesses reported he refused to cry or complain. He faced death with the same discipline he'd shown in the ring. Andy Hoog died on August 24, 2000, just 6 days after being diagnosed. The world kickboxing champion who'd seemed invincible had gone from healthy to dead in less than a week. His death shocked the martial arts world. Ramon Dekkers. On February 27, 2013, 43-year-old Ramon Dekkers was riding his bicycle through a tunnel in Breda, Netherlands. Dekkers, known as the Diamond, had been one of the greatest Muay Thai fighters in history. Despite not being Thai, he'd fought 223 professional bouts, many in Thailand against top Thai fighters. His cardio and endurance were legendary. By 2013, Dekkers had retired from active competition and was running a gym in Breda. That afternoon, he was taking a routine bicycle ride through his hometown. Around 3 p.m., Dekkers entered a tunnel while cycling. Inside the tunnel, Dekkers suddenly collapsed. He fell from his bicycle onto the pavement. Passers-by immediately called for help. An ambulance arrived quickly, and paramedics attempted resuscitation. Ramon Dekkers was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy revealed he'd suffered a massive heart attack while riding. The man who'd fought over 200 brutal Muay Thai battles, who'd never seemed to tire in the ring, died during light cardio exercise. His heart, which had carried him through countless rounds of intense combat, simply stopped while he was riding a bicycle. The irony wasn't lost on the martial arts community. The fighter with the most famous endurance in kickboxing died doing an activity far less strenuous than what he'd done thousands of times in training and competition. Benny Paret. On April 3, 1962, 25-year-old Benny "Kid" Paret died at Roosevelt Hospital in New York City. 10 days earlier, Paret had fought Emil Griffith for the welterweight championship at Madison Square Garden. The fight was broadcast live on national television, and what happened became one of boxing's most controversial moments. Paret and Griffith had fought twice before, splitting the matches. Their rivalry had grown personal. At the weigh-in before their third fight, Paret had touched Griffith's buttocks and called him maricón, a Spanish slur questioning Griffith's sexuality. Griffith, who was privately bisexual, was humiliated and enraged. On March 24, 1962, the two men entered the ring for their third fight. The bout was competitive through the early rounds. Both fighters landed shots, and the match seemed relatively even. Then came the 12th round. Griffith trapped Paret against the ropes in a corner. Paret's arms became tangled in the ropes, leaving him defenseless. Griffith unleashed a devastating combination. He landed 29 consecutive punches to Paret's head in approximately 18 seconds. Paret's head snapped back with each impact. Referee Ruby Goldstein finally stepped in to stop the fight, but the damage was done. Paret collapsed unconscious. He was carried from the ring on a stretcher and rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. Surgeons operated to relieve pressure on his brain, but Paret never regained consciousness. Benny Paret died on April 3, 1962, from the brain injuries sustained in the fight. He was 25 years old and left behind a wife and 2 young children. The beating had been captured on live television, making it arguably the first time millions of Americans watched a man die from injuries sustained in a sporting event. Emil Griffith was devastated by Paret's death. He continued boxing for years but was haunted by the killing. Griffith later said the incident destroyed his life. The fight led to calls for boxing reform and questions about the sport's brutality. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments. Edward Blackbeard Teach. On November 22, 1718, 38-year-old Edward Teach was anchored off Ocracoke Island, North Carolina, aboard his ship Adventure. Teach, known throughout the Atlantic world as Blackbeard, had terrorized merchant ships for years with his fearsome appearance and ruthless tactics. He wore his black beard in long braids, sometimes tucking slow-burning fuses under his hat to create a demonic smoking effect. By late 1718, colonial authorities had had enough. Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood commissioned Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to hunt down Blackbeard. Maynard sailed south with 2 small sloops, light, fast, single-masted warships built for speed and maneuverability, called the Jane and the Ranger. The ships carried no heavy cannons but were packed with sailors and Marines. Early on the morning of November 22nd, Maynard's vessels approached Ocracoke Inlet, where Blackbeard's ship was moored. Blackbeard spotted the approaching Royal Navy ships and prepared his crew for battle. As Maynard's sloops closed in, Blackbeard opened fire with his cannons. The opening volleys killed several of Maynard's men. Maynard ordered most of his remaining crew to hide below deck, making his ship appear nearly abandoned. Blackbeard took the bait. He brought his sloop alongside Maynard's vessel and led his pirates in boarding. As Blackbeard and his men climbed aboard, Maynard's hidden sailors suddenly emerged from below deck. A fierce hand-to-hand battle erupted on the blood-slicked deck. Blackbeard and Maynard confronted each other directly. The 2 men exchanged pistol shots at close range. Blackbeard was hit but continued fighting. The pirate captain drew his cutlass and struck at Maynard, breaking the officer's sword blade. As Blackbeard raised his arm to deliver what would have been a killing blow, one of Maynard's men slashed him across the throat from behind. Even with this terrible wound, Blackbeard kept fighting. Sailors surrounded him, firing pistols and hacking with cutlasses. Blackbeard absorbed approximately 5 pistol shots and 20 sword wounds before finally collapsing. The legendary pirate captain died on the deck. Maynard immediately drew his sword and severed Blackbeard's head from his body. The head was hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as a trophy. Blackbeard's headless corpse was thrown overboard into the waters of Ocracoke Inlet. Maynard sailed back to Virginia with the severed head still displayed. Upon arrival at Hampton Roads, authorities placed Blackbeard's head on a pike at the harbor entrance where it remained for years as a grim warning to anyone considering piracy. William Captain Kidd. On May 23, 1701, 56-year-old William Kidd stood at execution dock in Wapping, London, preparing to die. Kidd had been a respected privateer and ship captain before being accused of piracy and murder. His trial had been a spectacle, and he was convicted despite his protests that he had been betrayed by his backers. Execution Dock was London's traditional site for hanging pirates, located on the Thames River at low tide. The night before his execution, someone provided Kidd with large quantities of rum. By the time guards brought him to the scaffold the next morning, Kidd was completely drunk. He could barely stand as he was led up the gallows steps. The executioner placed the noose around Kidd's neck and positioned him on the platform. A large crowd had gathered to witness the death of the infamous Captain Kidd. The executioner pulled the lever. The platform dropped. Kidd fell through the trapdoor. Then something extraordinary happened. The rope snapped. Kidd crashed to the mud below the gallows, still alive. Some spectators shouted that this was a sign from God, that Kidd should be pardoned. Others in the crowd saw it as divine intervention. The executioner and guards quickly grabbed the dazed, drunken Kidd and dragged him back up the gallows stairs. A new rope was secured around his neck. Moments later, the trapdoor opened again. This time the rope held. William Kidd died by hanging at execution dock, but his ordeal wasn't over. Authorities had decided to make an extreme example of Kidd. His body was covered in tar to preserve it, then locked into an iron gibbet cage. The caged corpse was hung on a post at Tilbury Point on the Thames River. Kidd's tarred body remained on display for 3 years, slowly deteriorating as ships passed by. His head was mounted separately on a pike, and his personal effects were displayed publicly. The grim spectacle was meant to terrify any sailor who might consider turning pirate. Kidd's body hung in chains until the elements finally reduced it to bones, a warning visible to every vessel entering or leaving London. Stede Bonnet. On December 10, 1718, 30-year-old Stede Bonnet stood in Charlestown, South Carolina, preparing for his execution. Bonnet was unlike any other pirate of his era. Born into wealth on a Barbados plantation, he had abandoned his comfortable life as a gentleman to become a pirate, earning him the nickname the Gentleman Pirate. His brief piracy career had been largely unsuccessful, and he'd been captured after trying to establish a legitimate pardon. The morning of his execution, Bonnet dressed in his finest clothing as if attending a social function rather than his own hanging. He wore expensive garments befitting his aristocratic background. He even carried a small bouquet of flowers, though the blooms had wilted during his imprisonment. A militia unit assembled to escort Bonnet to the gallows. As the procession began, drummers beat a slow, somber death march. Bonnet walked through Charlestown streets toward the scaffold erected near the waterfront. Hundreds of colonists gathered to witness the execution. As Bonnet climbed the gallows steps, his composure began failing. The gentleman pirate's legs weakened, and he nearly fainted. Guards had to hold him upright as the executioner placed the noose around his neck. Bonnet was positioned on a cart beneath the gallows beam. The noose was tightened. Then the executioner cracked his whip. The cart lurched forward. Bonnet dropped, and the rope went taut. The gentleman pirate died dangling from the rope, his fine clothes and wilted flowers marking his strange end. But Charlestown authorities wanted to ensure Bonnet would not become a martyr or legend. After his body was cut down, it was taken to the marshlands below the high tide line. Workers dumped Bonnet's corpse in the muddy salt marsh where the tides would regularly cover it. The location was kept secret. Authorities wanted the sea and elements to erase all trace of Stede Bonnet's remains, ensuring no grave could become a shrine and no relics could inspire future pirates. The gentleman who had abandoned everything for piracy vanished into the Carolina mud. John Calico Jack Rackham. On November 18, 1720, 38-year-old John Rackham was hanged at Port Royal, Jamaica for piracy. Rackham had earned the nickname Calico Jack for his colorful calico clothing. He was famous not just for his piracy, but for having 2 women pirates in his crew, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who fought as fiercely as any man. Rackham's capture had come in October 1720, when a Jamaican sloop cornered his vessel off the coast. Most of Rackham's crew, including Calico Jack himself, had been drunk below deck. Only Anne Bonny and Mary Read fought vigorously against the boarders. After capture, all were taken to Jamaica for trial. The trial was swift. Rackham was found guilty and sentenced to death. Before his execution, Anne Bonny allegedly visited him in his cell and told him, "Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." On the day of his hanging, Rackham was taken to the gallows at Port Royal. A crowd gathered to watch the colorful pirate meet his end. The noose was placed around his neck. The trap opened. Calico Jack Rackham died by hanging. What happened next ensured Rackham would never be forgotten. Jamaican authorities decided his death would serve as a permanent warning. His body was removed from the gallows and locked inside an iron gibbet cage. The cage was designed to hold a human corpse upright, preventing burial. Rackham's caged body was transported to a small islet at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor. Workers erected a tall post on the tiny island and hung the gibbet cage from it. There, visible to every ship entering or leaving Port Royal, Calico Jack Rackham's body hung in its iron prison. The tropical sun baked his corpse. Seabirds picked at the remains through the cage bars. Rain and wind weathered the bones. The spot became known as Rackham's Cay. His skeleton reportedly remained on display for years, swaying in the Caribbean breeze as ships sailed past. The desiccated bones served their intended purpose as a stark warning to anyone considering piracy in Jamaican waters. Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts. On February 10, 1722, 40-year-old Bartholomew Roberts was commanding his ship Royal Fortune off the coast of Cape Lopez in West Africa. Roberts was the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, having captured over 400 vessels during his career. He was known for his elaborate dress, often wearing rich fabrics and gold chains. He also maintained strict discipline aboard his ships, and rarely drank, preferring tea. That morning, the British Royal Navy warship HMS Swallow appeared on the horizon. Roberts's crew had been celebrating the previous night, and many were still drunk or hungover. Despite his crew's condition, Roberts decided to engage the warship rather than flee. It was an uncharacteristic decision that would prove fatal. As the Royal Fortune closed with HMS Swallow, the British warship fired its cannons. Grape shot, clusters of small iron balls, tore across the deck of Roberts's ship. One blast struck Roberts directly. The grape shot tore through his throat, causing massive trauma. Bartholomew Roberts died instantly, collapsing on his deck while wearing his famous crimson jacket and gold chain. His crew immediately panicked. They knew that if Roberts's body was captured, the British would display it as a trophy. Roberts had made his wishes clear. He wanted no public spectacle of his corpse. His loyal crew members acted quickly. They lifted Roberts's body, still dressed in his finery, and carried it to the ship's rail. They wrapped chains around the corpse to weigh it down. Then they heaved Black Bart Roberts overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. His body sank immediately and was never recovered. Minutes after Roberts went into the sea, HMS Swallow closed in and overwhelmed the leaderless, drunken pirate crew. Most were captured and later hanged, but Roberts himself had escaped the fate of being displayed in chains. His body remained somewhere in the waters off West Africa, and his legend grew larger because no one could point to his remains hanging from a gibbet. Charles Vane. On March 29, 1721, 41-year-old Charles Vane was executed at Port Royal, Jamaica. Vane had been one of the most violent and uncompromising pirates of his era, refusing multiple offers of pardon and attacking ships without mercy. His downfall had begun when his own crew, led by Calico Jack Rackham, voted him out as captain after Vane refused to attack a French warship. Months later, Vane's ship wrecked during a hurricane. He survived on a deserted island for weeks before being rescued by a passing ship. Unfortunately for Vane, the ship's captain recognized him. Vane was transported to Jamaica, imprisoned, and tried for piracy. The verdict was never in doubt. At his trial, Vane showed no remorse and offered no defense. On the morning of his execution, guards brought Vane from his cell to the gallows erected at Port Royal. A crowd gathered to watch the notorious pirate die. Vane walked to the scaffold defiantly. Contemporary witnesses recorded that he went to his death with no plea but defiance in his eye, showing no fear or regret. The executioner placed the noose around Vane's neck. The trap opened. Charles Vane dropped and died by hanging. His defiant expression was frozen on his face. Jamaican authorities weren't satisfied with simply hanging Vane. They wanted to make an enduring example of him. His body was cut down from the gallows and covered with tar to preserve it. The tarred corpse was then wrapped in chains and hung from a gibbet post in a public location. Vane's body swayed in the Caribbean breeze, visible to colonists and sailors alike. The tarred, chained corpse hung on display for weeks, slowly deteriorating under the tropical sun. Birds pecked at the remains through the gaps in the chains. Eventually, Vane's body was reduced to bones, but even then the skeleton remained on exhibit, a grim reminder that pirates who refused mercy would receive none in return. Mary Red. On an April day in 1721, 26-year-old Mary Red died in Spanish Town Prison, Jamaica. Red had lived an extraordinary life, disguising herself as a man to serve as a soldier, and later becoming one of history's most famous female pirates. She had fought alongside Anne Bonny aboard Calico Jack Rackham's ship, and witnesses testified that she fought more courageously than most of the male pirates when their ship was captured. After their capture in October 1720, Mary Red and Anne Bonny were brought to trial with the rest of Rackham's crew. Both women were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. However, when the judge pronounced the sentence, both women immediately declared they were pregnant. Under English law, the execution of pregnant women was postponed until after childbirth to protect the unborn child. Authorities imprisoned both women while awaiting confirmation of their pregnancies and eventual delivery. Mary Reed was held in the Spanish Town prison in Jamaica. The conditions were terrible, with poor sanitation, inadequate food, and no medical care. By April 1721, Reed had developed a high fever. Some accounts suggest the fever was related to childbirth or pregnancy complications, while others simply describe it as prison fever, likely typhus or another infectious disease common in jails of that era. Prison officials noted that she died in prison, reportedly after developing a fever. Her death came quickly. Mary Red died in her cell at Spanish Town Prison, only in her mid-20s. Unlike most of her fellow pirates who died at the end of a rope or displayed in gibbets, Red's death came from illness behind bars. She was buried in an unmarked grave, likely in a common burial ground for prisoners. Anne Bonny's fate after this point remains mysterious. Historical records show she too claimed pregnancy and avoided immediate execution, but no record of her execution exists. She simply disappeared from historical accounts, leading to speculation that she was released, escaped, or died in prison without documentation. Mary Red became one of the few famous female pirates whose death came not from execution, but from disease, a common killer in the brutal prison conditions of the 18th century. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.